Welcome to the Sonic Days podcast, home of all things audio. This season was recorded live at Sonic Days 2024. What's the difference between immersive sound and envelopment? Why do we enjoy the feeling of being surrounded by sound? And how can we capture that sensation in a way that feels real and emotionally powerful? This talk explores immersive formats and the concept of envelopment, with a focus on maintaining realism from recording to reproduction.
This session will talk about auditory envelopment and different 3D formats, how 3D formats are better at getting that sensation across than our normal formats like stereo, for instance. Eddy will provide first an overview of the different formats, and then I'll talk more specifically about this percept auditory envelopment that has sort of been, you could consider it, for instance, when you go to a good concert in a good concert hall, you could consider it the soul of the concert hall. So if we can get auditory envelopment across, then we're actually part of solving the holy grail of music reproduction. But it's very overlooked, unfortunately, and there have been a lot of papers since the 80s that have not really paid enough attention to this, but let's get back to that later. With all of that, Eddy, please.
Okay, what I'm going to provide you is a kind of overview. You could say, where do these formats come from? What have people been trying out during the years? And are there any good ideas to pick up for anything different if you want to try out something else? Because we have very often locked to some specific formats and we try to fill in there. Anyone here working with sound art of any kind? You are? Good. A couple of people are. And there could be some ideas for that. So that's where it all starts. If you cannot do your mono, go home. So that's the one. Okay. 2-channel stereo. When did that arrive? What do you think? 46s? 50s? 81. Even earlier. Yeah. This guy, Clement Adair, he invented a microphone. It's with carbon sticks, rods that was put into a box like the size of a cigar box. In Paris, there would be a exhibition about electricity, and the telephone was just invented. And he wanted to demonstrate that you can have direct sound in a telephone. And he made this setup here. You can see down to the left all the microphones along the edge of the stage. And then you would pick 2 microphones with a huge distance, and that would go to different hearing pieces for a headset. And people would stand, as you see, upper right, they would stand and listen to this from the opera. So that was quite an experience, and people were amazed because they could hear in 2D what was going on there. Then we got the 3-channel stereo. That was much later, but not that much later, because in 1998, this was a device that was made that would have a row. You would have 3 pickups going down to it, so you had 3 separate tracks and 3 separate reproducers. Due to the mechanical disturbance that would be in it, it would be just like having 3 flanges on top of each other for the same signal, basically. It says in the middle, an intensity of volume, sweetness, and richness of tone. And I guess that's right. If you've tried ever to put flanges or chorus, a 3-way chorus on a signal, that's a kind of envelopment, I should say.
But it was pretty expensive, it seemed.
Yeah. It cost like a smaller farm or something, or a larger one,
Yeah.
$1,000 at that time. Then we got some pseudo stereo at a point in time. Basically, Holger Lauritsen, he was at Danish Broadcasting. He was managing the R&D department, and he worked with how to make radio more interesting and more enveloping. So he designed this, what you see in the middle in yellow field, 1 loudspeaker out in the front, pointing at the listener, and then 1 in a baffle that would create a figure 8 directivity pattern because it was open to the back. And then he would have an M signal for the mid signal and an S for the side signal. And he would eventually add a delay with using a tape recorder. So he could make a variable delay to the side signal. So people could decide how big a room they had for the listening, because the more delay they had, the later the side reflections or side part of the signal would arrive. And he actually made the first microphone that was configured as an MS microphone, and invented the principle. He used two M1 microphones from Neumann for that purpose. Neumann got, then they later on produced the SM1, SM2 stereo microphones built with that principle. Then we had some years with quadraphony. Some records came out, but you had 3 different reproduction systems. So it was difficult to buy just a turntable for it, or defining what kind of records you wanted to use. You needed 3 different kind of decoders to make it work at that time. Most records that were sold at that time would be demonstration records, with orchestras walking around in the room and stuff like that, and test tones and things like that. The binaural thing was also introduced at some time. We know it now. We can use artificial head, or we can use our own heads with a microphone to put in the ear. Here are some of the artificial ones. Here is a guy from Danish National School of Performing Art. He made a small project. He made a copy of his own head without hair, and then he built microphones into the ear. You can see upper left, DPA 4060 in the ear, and he used that to record a performance. Actually, he put that head in a bed at the hospital, and then you could experience his death, or as an audience you could experience your own death, where the people were discussing about the heritage and stuff across the bed when you were in the room, and you couldn't do anything at all. It was quite amazing as a performance. We got some matrixed audio, and we had that for a number of years. That would be Dolby Stereo, Dolby Pro Logic. The system was actually that you could encode 4 channels into 2, and we still in some gaming systems have used the system, but that was popular for a number of years. And the ideal thing was you could use a microphone technique to place the things there, so you did not need to have a encoder to do it. You could make signals. So you would have different kind of Pro Logic decoders. Also other brands than Dolby provided different kind of decoding. Then we got the multi-channel virtual reality, which basically is a part of what we're doing now, but these days the purest form, it's basically for scientific use. Also you listen in anechoic chambers, or because you want to make soundscape analysis, or making, for instance, virtual rooms for presenting how much sound insulation you have from windows and how affected you get from traffic noise and stuff like that. You can present that to people in rooms like that with systems of this kind. Also, at some time, we got some virtual surround and loudspeaker reproduction, basically like this. For instance, there was a system developed in England called Stereo Dipole, where it actually worked quite well with loudspeakers that were very close to each other on each side of a screen, for instance. And actually you would have a lot of information also outside the width of the loudspeakers. So you could have information that you perceived as coming from the rear as well with this system. And that's basically what we have been using for a number of years, also as a processing to add on to your television set or something like that. Then later on, suddenly it became digital, and we got the opportunity to have 5.1, 6.1, 7.1, all in one plane basically. So we had the ITU setup that we still are working with as a standard setup for 5-channel surround sound. On film, the development was basically more like this. You would have a mono, and then you had Dolby Stereo, which would be the kind of thing with the matrix down to 2-channel in the carrier, the medium you use for it. Then it became digital. Not this one. Yes, this one is digital SRD, because you would have spectral recording and you have digital sound. And then other brands made their position here, Digital Theater System, DTS, and Sony Dynamic Digital System. And then these 5 front and 2 back side channels were not enough. So it became this system, so you would have a rear system and something of a side. All this was included on this optic piece of film. So to your left, you would have the SDDS, the Sony system, with digital information. In the middle, with the double D, of course, is a Dolby digital. And then you would have, to the right, you will have a time code for playback of a CD, a couple of CDs. You will have a box with CDs. So basically, the DTS was the first digital system that was introduced in many cinemas. I remember myself, the first time I heard a digital film in the cinema was at the Faroe Island in Tórshavn. That would be the place I would be the latest to experience digital sound in the cinema, but that was there because it was so easy to install, just a time code reader and a box with a couple of CDs, and that worked. Also, the original analog tracks, 2-track, which would be encoded normally in Dolby Stereo as 4 channels coded down to 1 and then unfolded to 4 channels again, center, left, right, and 1 surround channel. Then it became more exotic, you could say. Tomlinson Holman, he made his system 10.2 and found out that it would be a good idea to have some upper speakers as well that could add something to the dimension. That was what he did with the system. It became even more exotic, as it still is. In Japan, you have 22.2 channels. That's a number. So that's the basic setup. Ultra high definition. You have an upper layer with 9 channels, the middle layer with 10 channels, and then you have 3 channels in front and 2 LFE channels. So it really provides you with a lot of information. And it's amazing to listen to a system like that, but it's also a rather demanding production technique it takes to make that work if you want to work with natural recordings of stuff. It's amazing. Then, not out of the blue, but as a sum of all this came wave field synthesis, which is rather interesting. I have seen it. The only school I've seen it working at is at Detmold in Germany. They have a room with such a system. We tried to install it at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen when that was introduced, the new acting house. But there was no software for producing for this format. Basically, one of the setup is like this. You see 64 loudspeakers all around in the horizontal plane. And the idea is that you can reconstruct every wave front of any wave that starts somewhere behind the line of loudspeakers. So it seems like it is out there, but the loudspeaker is here. But because of the way the wavefront is acting and moving, you can have a good impression and perception of distant sources, very precise image of that source, even for live purposes, even though you don't have a sweet spot, but you have a sweeter area. It works over a much larger area than any other systems. The problem is just you need that many loudspeakers to produce something that is, that whether you have some kind of fidelity for that. And then in the bottom of all this is what we more or less have now, Audio 3D. Of course, it's been around for some years. Then came 579.14, for instance. And then Dolby Atmos kicked itself in somewhere in the corner down there. The thing is now, basically the standard is that we have upper layer when we want to get immersive. The question is whether we get envelopment. That's what Thomas will talk about. Basically, immersion is just the thing that we have sound all around. And when it really gets enveloping, that's a good question. So we have these speakers, and as you will know, for instance, Morten Lindberg, when he produces his thing, he is basically channel-based because each microphone goes to one channel. If he reduces the output format to fewer channels, then he just cut off the channels he doesn't need and does not mix anything down. So we are in a business where there are different approaches on making mixes that fulfills our purpose with our production, either from panning, adding stuff, delay, whatever, grouping, making objects as we do with Atmos, or making a more clean channel recording where everything is in the right space and there's no comb filtering from the production itself. If there's a comb filtering, it would be in the reproduction, but it's more clean. So the question is, what actually will provide the best thing? This is the Lindberg version of recording, and what we've been doing at the Danish National School of Performing Art. That's a cheap version of a Lindberg setup. You can use miniature microphones for it. Of course, you have to organize the wires so it's all down. But the upper layer is the end of each rod of this drying stand. And it costs about 200 kroner, so that's a cheap version. When that is done, you just can collapse it all afterwards. And you can go out in the field with your recording setup that's not very expensive. That works actually quite well. Yeah, that's also one I've been using a number of times. It's horizontal. At the time, DPA had a lot of D names for all their products, so this would be the D bucket. But that's just a bucket for paint. And there are 8 miniature microphones, and you can use it, for instance, if you want to pan for 360 degrees headphone recording. This is actually perfect because you can pan between them 2 and 2 all the way around and make head tracking based on a signal like this. So it's also a simple version of doing something you want to do. The Oro 3D was the one that also really, that was actually, when I heard the Oro demos the first time years ago, that was first time I understood the importance of the upper channels, because some of the demos I heard, they suddenly got much more precise in the horizontal plane when it had the upper microphones included, as well as the upper systems, upper layer reproduction as well. You can even have a loudspeaker in the ceiling if you can get a wire out to it. Dolby Atmos is basically a cinema format, but it's introduced to people in private homes as well, and you can use the wall as a ceiling as a reflector. Perhaps that will work. So that was my part.
Thanks, Eddy. So let's carry on with a little bit more, maybe to the nerdy side. The issue here is that, as I said in the introduction, that it's much, we can maybe even consider it the soul of a concert hall. So it's really, if we can reproduce this perceptual quality, we'll be much better at also conveying the sense of a nice space like a cathedral or a church or a nice concert hall. But not only that, we can control the space much better. So it's not just a question of creating great big spaces, it's more a question of controlling the space. So sometimes you want your sound to be intimate, sometimes you want it to be grandiose, and the ability to combine the two means that you have to have a grip on this parameter in the first place. And as a good recent example of pop artists that use this really, really proficiently, it would be Beyoncé, for instance, and Billie Eilish. They both use this immensely, this concept. So it's not just a question of fine classical music, but it's any human can hear it. You can hear it, a small child can hear it, a guy of 96 years old can hear it. So it's really something we should pay a little bit more attention to. At the end of this talk, I hope we have a little bit, maybe 5 minutes, where some of Florian's examples, because he has done some outdoor recordings, where if you have certain criteria fulfilled in outdoor recordings, you can even create the sense of envelopment. But that means that you need some movement in the sources. So that could be nature sources like waves or a thunderstorm or wind that can create that same sensation as we can hear in a concert hall. But let's distinguish between the two. Eddy stopped at between immersiveness and envelopment, because they're distinctively different. Immersion, we can create that easily with just throwing up a lot of speakers around us. We can have sound from any azimuth, means just it can come from anywhere basically. And it doesn't need to be very complex. It could be birds singing in different places around you. It could be also effect sounds of pistol, gunfire in one channel or things like that. So it's basically very much dependent on direct sound and maybe a few lower order reflections. But that's very different from envelopment, because in envelopment, indirect sound might actually be more than the direct. But the most important thing about envelopment is that sound follows some developing patterns. So it's not just a question of the bird sitting there and singing in that channel. There's something happening around you that is pleasant. So you could say generally, Florian's recordings will be the exception to this. Immersion is generally an outdoor quality. That's where we hear the discrete birds. Or in theater, that's where we hear it as well. While the good concert hall or the church is where we can get these developing patterns when music is being played in the space. And that's the important thing, because music with different pitch makes the sound move around in a good space. And that's the whole concept here. But let me just come back to the motivation why I've been studying this for so long. From the early days of listening tests in TC, the people that were testing these reverbs, they started craving a certain quality of the sound or of the reverb. It was qualities where they could feel the room suddenly expanding. And reverb designers, and by that I mean different companies like Lexicon and Quantec and TC and other companies, we independently came to the same conclusions, that if we introduced small low frequency change and movements in the reverb, regardless if it's stereo or if it's surround or if it's 3D reverb, it improves that quality again. So it becomes something that becomes much more credible when you listen to it even in a small room, because you get some characteristics of the large room that sort of survives the reproduction. Many conductors I've spoken to and musicians also, they react positively when this type of variation is experienced, low frequency variation. So that is the main thing here, that it's a low frequency phenomena, and it is about change in that low frequency in a controlled way. So how do we do that, and what could it possibly have to do with touch? There are some neuroscientists, Jaak Panksepp, for instance, a famous one, said that hearing is a different form of touch. And I think he's right in many ways, and that's also then interesting too. There's this recent study from Gothenburg, Göteborg in Sweden, where they found out that touch has another dimension. Normally we use touch as something discriminative. We can feel when a fly sits on our arm and we can react to that. But there's also, or we can feel pain of course, an affective input to touch at a very low threshold, which means that a very light touch, we have certain fibers in the skin that picks up that certain type of touch. And if you have just the right conditions, that's what I call Goldilocks conditions. In Danish, de tre små bjørne, not too much of this, not too much of that, just right. If you have those conditions, then you get striatal engagement. And striatal engagement means that the brain starts producing endorphins, which is like positive reactions to what you're feeling. So if somebody is touching you just the right way, just the right force, just the right speed, just the right temperature, then it releases endorphins in the receiver. And the Swedes found out that that is likely a sensory, they called it underpinning of social behavior. So we become more social by having that functionality built into our physiology. So we're detecting change or friendly change around us. So how does that relate to vision? Vision, we have this very sharp vision in front of us, only a degree and a half of our 180-degree viewing angle, but that's where we see sharp and we see color, and that's where we see 3D. But you could also turn it around and say the peripheral field, which is everything outside those 1.5 degrees, that's where we detect movement and change, even in low light conditions. Most of our visual field actually detects motion, like, again, we are beings that really are obsessed with detecting motion around us. And of course, it's for evolutionary reason. And hearing has the same, actually. This is now sliced through the brain, and the auditory nerve arrives there. The 8th nerve I talked about earlier arrives at the base of the brainstem here, and nerve impulses eventually go out up to the auditory cortexes that are here at the sides. But actually, even though they get the publicity, the cortices, this is where the fun happens. That's in the brainstem, and that's where all those ahead of consciousness functions happen. So this is where we, for instance, detect envelopment or interoral correlation at low frequency. And that happens completely automatically, and even when we are sleeping. So it is a really highly prioritized system. And to show you how prioritized it really is, these are the two cochlears, those are the two ears and the two auditory nerves called nerve number 8 here. And we arrive then at the brainstem. But this little circuit here, those are the fastest firing synapses of the entire brain, much, much faster than anything related to any other sense, including vision. And that's where we pick up localization and envelopment ahead of consciousness. So consciousness is still 400 milliseconds further down the road to your right here. But ahead of consciousness, we pick up those patterns of movement again, and we can react to them very quickly. So that's the physiological, you can say, substrate of auditory envelopment. So we did some tests, and I'll just briefly describe them because it could otherwise get very nerdy. The first would be just the audibility of low frequency change in naive listeners, so which means non-audio engineers. And the listeners were just comparing correlated versus uncorrelated sound of very low frequency sound. So you can see we have a 16th order low pass at 150 hertz. So basically a brick wall at 150 hertz. The only thing they're listening to is if the sound is correlated or uncorrelated. We're using Sennheiser HD600s, and the listeners were listening at 72 dB SPL, C-weighted. There was an equal loudness between, of course, correlated and uncorrelated, but subjects could adjust the overall loudness for comfort plus minus 6 dB if they wanted. Here's an example of one of the girls listening here. In these first tests, we had 31 subjects, Danish and Norwegian, and the first question is, could these naive people tell a difference? You can see these are the age groups over here. So could they reliably tell a difference between the correlated and uncorrelated low frequency sound? It came out that everybody could. Also, old people with much HL, like the previous talk, is hearing loss. So also old people with severe hearing loss, the hearing aid was switched off for these tests. But normally you don't have hearing loss at very low frequency. So that's the only thing we just tested for, that they could hear on both ears. So all people, even at the eldest was 96 here, could tell that difference. So what did they associate the two sounds with, just using their own words? The reason why we didn't go below 6 years was we found out in a pilot test that children below the age of 6 were unreliable, or they didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they heard. So the answers here from all these people were that the correlated sound was unpleasant and associated with a small or restricted space. In Danish, these words would apply. Lille, spærret inde, uhyggelig, mørk, while, and you can see the English and the German translation there as well. While the uncorrelated low-frequency sound across all subjects was associated with friendly meaning, and that was completely without exception. So then we went on at this recent report from test 1 and 2 I reported at AS in New York earlier, but in maybe a month ago, and this one, test 3 and 4, have only been reported so far at the SEMTA conference. So test 3 and 4, we wanted to find out if it was only what we heard or also what we felt with the body. Was auditory envelopment, did our bodies play a role in that or not? So what we did was an outdoor test. This is in an open space far away from buildings, at top of a little hill, rolling hill, and you can see the frequency response is basically flat from 18 hertz to 120 hertz here, without any correction at all. So in this case, we didn't use low frequency sounds below 150 hertz. We now went down to around the half of that, so 72 hertz. So we used correlated or uncorrelated sound when you're sitting between those two subwoofers there. You'd either be sitting like the girl here, like in graphic B, or the girl could turn like this. And that way we can, of course, find out if there is a difference. It's very difficult, of course, to isolate the ears otherwise, because you cannot just influence the ears, so it's better to influence the entire body. That was the pilot test showing that. So now the subjects would raise their left arm if they heard the small restricted sound, or the right arm if they heard a big open sound. And the smallest kids, they got a little rubber band on the left finger or left arm so they could tell difference between left and right. In this condition, everybody could hear the big open sound when listening like this, tell big open from, so the correlated from the uncorrelated. But when it turned like this, nobody could hear it. Then turning the heads in either condition gave the opposite response, 100% reliably. So it means that this is an auditory percept only. This is not punch or something like that. So remember, of course, there can be things where we want stimulation on the body that has a good effect, but for this particular percept, for this condition, it's not important. The body is not important. It doesn't play a role in auditory envelopment. Then we tested for the low frequency limit. How low did people reliably, or the subjects reliably, hear it? 7 of the 10 subjects could still tell the correlated from the uncorrelated with a low pass of 54. Remember, we were 72 to start with, where everybody could. Most of them could at 54. Fewer could at 41, and really nobody could reliably at 30 hertz. So that would also be only a little less than 1 octave, because the subwoofers were from 18 hertz, so about an octave, but nobody could really tell it. So the study showed a recognizable and similar assessment of auditory envelopment in naive listeners across the ages, and it was an oral percept, meaning more than the body. We are doing new tests actually. When Florian was visiting me, you were part of a test panel with more tests in this area, because with experienced listeners, we might want to investigate it even further. But for now, let's just say that the study showed a remarkably similar response. When I call it abstract auditory envelopment, it's different from music, because music, of course, is not abstract. So there could be a difference between auditory envelopment in music, which might be stronger than abstract auditory envelopment, which after all is only randomness. But people can tell random change from what we call stasis, or things just being the same. So by the way acoustics work, when we play music indoors, it creates patterns of moving low-frequency sound around. This is just a question of pitch changing a little bit, or by musicians standing at different places in the room. David Griesinger, and I think you probably heard that also many times, Eddy, he also described it at many conferences, or tried to replicated, and there was always a good discussion, and nobody really...
Except for Tom Holman.
Yeah, except for Tom Holman, yeah. He recognized it as well, and so interestingly also Tom Holman, I've just been in contact with him for the last couple of days. He has been traveling around in Japan, listening to concert halls in Japan to hear the same concert in different halls for this particular, you could say, percept. So it was quite funny. And as a side note, when I did the talk in Hollywood, there were many Dolby people there, and I joked with the old CTO of Dolby that Tom Holman was traveling around in Japan to hear the qualities that Dolby Atmos threw away. So that was a little bit harsh, of course, but it was quite fun still. But Dolby Atmos is two things, just that you all know. Dolby Atmos consumer is basically AC3, so that's a very old system, and that's what throws auditory envelopment away. Dolby Atmos in cinema certainly does not, so because that's a much newer format, and hopefully Dolby will update their AC3 format at some point. But for the time being, it really just removes this or is unreliable. So that very sophisticated and very energy-hungry physiology we all share in our brainstem, of course, is for good reason. In this case, we can use it to detect auditory envelopment and maybe even pre-categorize what we're hearing into friendly or hostile sounds. That's at least the theory that comes also from this affective touch study. So what we are actually investigating is LF stasis, which just means that everything is static, versus change and movement at low frequency. And that is just extremely important. So it, of course, I don't want to go through all the details here, but of course you can see that this has implications also for mono sub-bass management and things like that, that is completely detrimental to this excellent quality. And the final thing I'll just show you here before we hear a few examples is that it might actually be the first sense we are even able to experience, because the ear it is finally developed around the age of 3 months into pregnancy. So this is in the womb. To left of the pink line is in the baby in the foster in the womb, and around 4 months the brainstem is developed enough that it could detect auditory envelopment. The auditory cortexes are not finally developed yet, so there's a good reason to think that this is the first sensation we are even able to hear. Localization first becomes available really around the age of when we have been born, so around the age of 2 months and so forth. So the main point here is that auditory envelopment might be the first sense we're able to detect, and it seems also from the old people a pleasure that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. The auditory system might detect the same Goldilocks conditions like we do with friendly touch, and also possibly release substances in our body to the tissues and to the bloodstream that helps us feel pleasure and maybe also socialize. There might be a gender difference here, and I'm a little bit, of course, worried about bringing this topic up these days because there's so much discussion about it. But in the friendly touch or in the affective touch research, it seems that women are generally more sensitive to this particular percept than men are. This remains to be seen, of course. Then, of course, there's also, this one has also raised eyebrows a couple of times, both in Gothenburg at the automotive conference and AES and now at SEMTE, because I think if I was 30 again, listening to myself now, I'd probably say, what a piece of crap. I'm only interested in punch and high level and things like that. And so I think there might be some, you could say, lack of appreciation for it. And because much of our industry has been driven over many, many years by young male engineers, it might be simply something we have overlooked, unfortunately. So conclusion, playing music or singing indoors in caves, cathedrals or concert halls has been practiced for thousands of years and stimulated our ancestors. So this intraoral low frequency change sensitivity is universal and remarkable. The physiologic behind it might be that it has commonalities with friendly touch, so promoter of bonding and peaceful coexistence. Then the fidelity, auditory envelopment fidelity and 3D formats should be prioritized in entertainment and listening, because 3D formats in a good room have a much better chance of getting this across. So this would be the case also in domestic sound, in gaming and in automotive sound. Finally, we should prevent faulty data that we have produced in the pro audio industry from the last 30 years from polluting, you could say, artificial intelligent algorithms, so they think that humans cannot hear this, because then we are sort of into a loop where nobody would experience it unless they went to a concert hall again. So what we have is actually a chain that is only as strong as all its elements here. So from capturing, like with Florian's cat over here, skinned cat, to the recording of it, making sure that we have discrete channels, to the production side, to the distribution side and the reproduction side. And these are some of the areas where it can go wrong. We can have bad mic arrays that don't pick up auditory envelopment in a relevant way. We can be mixing channels together in the recording. We can do level panning, and in production, of course you're free to do level panning, but you just need to understand that that you potentially destroy this percept. And you have to do monitoring to standards. On the distribution side, the lossy codecs or rogue loudness, by that I mean that you're just squashing things needlessly that can destroy the source, of course. On the reproduction side, bass management, I'm not calling it bass management, normally I call it bass mismanagement, is a topic here. Headphone renderers can be very random. So for instance, when you listen to whatever renderer you're listening to, it often imposes some random room, and can you trust that or not? And finally, the listening room and the distance you're listening at can obstruct auditory envelopment. But with that, Florian, I think we should just have a few minutes of your tracks here.
This is the picture before, Thomas, yeah, of the East Coast. The East Coast, yeah. That's this one, yeah.
Moesgaard Strand at Aarhus.
So of course you have the movement of the waves, in front of the microphone, the direct sources, and it's a very long beach, so that you have, but not so much decorrelated low end all around because it was a very calm day. Next one is on the West Coast, which has a lot more decorrelation going on because I was actually standing in the water. Yeah, so I took off my shoes later on in a different session. This was the first try, but later on I actually took off my shoes and went into the water and had placed also the microphone into the water. So you will get at one point some effect that the water washes below you to the back and these kind of things. And because it's a much heavier surf on the west side, there's more low end, and you have already, this low end movement going on. So that's the West Coast. So this is the West Coast, yeah? So you already have a lot more decorrelation going on.
And you could hear by the low frequency here, because it's decorrelated, it actually gives you some of that envelopment, auditory envelopment sensation. And even me sitting here outside completely the sweet spot, I can get that sensation. That's one of the things about envelopment, that if you get it reconstructed, recently picked up and reconstructed, it's very much more robust than localization is in 3D.
Yes. Next is even more decorrelation to the low end with thunderstorms. Maybe I just jump to a lightning strike. Yeah, but another one coming. Now the birds are quiet. See, especially the low-level rumbling. It's as Thomas said, a very good sign for some robust decorrelation and envelopment if you sit or stand outside the rig. I'm sitting outside the rig, and I get quite a good sensation of there's not only this loudspeaker, but it's really in the room, The room, of course, plays also a major role. Next one is a quick example, because we are really a little bit pressed for time, of a hailstorm. I recorded a complete hailstorm sequence 3 years ago, 1.5 hours, and this is just in the middle where the hail had started to fall, and just have a listen to the individual sounds, which is kind of the immersive quality that Thomas was alluding to, of individual hail balls, but then the thunder coming in, which is this decorrelated low-end stuff. So it's both sides basically, which is very often the case in nature for these type of sounds, wind and waves and thunder and these kind of things. Hail has already started. Okay, I put it to the next. So you have a combination here of both, which I find very interesting, these very individual hail sounds and then the low-end rumble. Now, it's not always the flashy stuff that is, for me, interesting, but also the low-level one. And now we have some pure wind in the grass. That's Iceland recordings now. Actually, the West Coast recording is super fresh, from the waves, because I did that yesterday. So you really heard something super, fresh. So
the cat is still wet.
The cat is still a little bit wet, and my feet are still a little bit numb. But there was yesterday's recording, yesterday afternoon actually. It's just 24 hours old what you heard. Anyway, this is a wind. Thomas will show you then later a picture of that. It's on the north coast, northeast coast, or northeast part of Iceland, and it's just wind in the grass. And then on the right side is a small stream. So when the wind recedes a little bit, you might hear this distant stream, distant waters gurgling. But it's a much lower level sound, and but it still has this kind of enveloping quality because of the wind moving through the grass. So this is another compromise I had to take. I want to record, of course, as low as possible. So I need a microphone that is best suited to record low frequency, which is an omnidirectional microphone, a pure pressure transducer. But an omnidirectional microphone doesn't give me, significant level differences. But I want a little bit of level differences for the direct sources in nature. So the compromise is to take, for me at least, is to take a wide cardioid. A wide cardioid has 2/3 omni components, so I can get the low end I want, but it has at least 10 dB front to back attenuation, so I get a bit of level differences. So that's another of the compromises I need to take, size-wise, polar characteristic-wise. Life is a compromise, as you know, full of compromises, and also outdoor recording is a compromise. Although you could argue I do as few compromises as possible with this beast, but still, there are compromises. Last one is a beach in the north of Iceland, actually, a stony beach with pebbles. Thomas is showing some pictures then later. And the microphone is very close to the water again, and you have the waves coming up to the microphone. And then on the receding side of the waves, you hear all those pebbles then rolling down again. which gives for a very interesting sound quality again. So there are actually here 3 distinct frequency ranges of decorrelation. There is the pebbles in the mid-frequency range, which are spread all over the beach, which is of course completely random, so it's kind of noisy-like. Then you have the low end of the waves, which is also spread around, and then you have the high hissing sound of the foam of the waves back. So there's these 3 ranges, and they all are decorrelated. Yeah, they all help in this aspect. That was it. Thank you. Thank you. But I think it tied in very well with what Thomas was saying, that this is not only indoor possible, but you need a certain, certain elements to it, and one of that is movement, of course. Yeah.
Right. And just for those of you who have heard Morten Lindberg's recordings or Kimio Hamasaki's or some of those recordings where you use very spaced omnis indoor, they of course have less restrictions than Florian, and then you can get the low frequency decorrelation even to lower frequencies. So that's a little bit different ball game. Then you can use omnis rather than wide cardioids. But I would like to bring in Eddy actually on wide cardioids just for a final comment. Maybe
I think it's correct what Florian said, that the wide cardioid is actually perfect for this kind of thing, because you have this backside reduction. So it works quite well.
Mm-hmm. I would like to have some level differences also from something only in the back, for instance. Yeah, if there's a bird in the back or whatever, direct sources, with omnidirectional microphones, every microphone picks it up basically with the same level with a rig like that. But with the wide cardioids, I have 10 dB of front-to-back attenuation. So at least I get a little bit more chance that we have a more discrete placement here. But I don't want to give up all the decorrelation you get in the low end with distance between microphones. So the wide cardioid for me is the compromise, yeah.
I hope it was useful, guys. Thanks for coming.